Welcome to Open Government Chicago. We should have been numbering these all along. Yeah, what number is it? Let's guess. That sounds right. My name is Joe Jamoska. I'm co-founder of this group with Dan O'Neill. Since Dan's on the, I usually am content to let him MC, but since he's on the agenda tonight, I offer to take over the presentational coordination. Thanks, as always, to the Chicago Community Trust for hosting us, and the Smart Chicago Collaborative for providing us with food, tortillas, inspired. We should start taking suggestions for other creations.
Right now.
Not right now, but you can put them in the meeting notes. So if you haven't been to one of these before, we're live streaming, and you can catch this on Google, but if you're here, you should probably just watch us and not your screen. But we also do Google Docs that everyone can edit to take notes, so if you have a device and would like to, it's a bit.ly URL 10P Z6RT. It's also in the Meetup thing if you just want to go to the Meetup link and click on it. It's in one of the comments, I think, right? Is that right, Chris? You put it in the comments?
It's in the comment for the Meetup.
But so it's kind of cool to just see it all flying and have everybody putting their piece down, so there's a record of what happened. It seems like a lot of familiar faces, but some new faces too. I'm just curious, for whom is this the first time at OpenGov Chicago event? Well, welcome. If you haven't been coming, you may not realize that tonight's topic is sort of on the heels of a theme, a recurring motif of late. We had a meeting about where we tried to sort of have some thoughtful critiques of the open government movement. We've had some talks about design. We're kind of raising the issue that a lot of this stuff gets done out of a surplus of enthusiasm for technology and transparency, but sometimes the loop isn't closed with the fact that these efforts towards openness are meant to serve people. And so tonight we really wanted to get some conversation going about how to make sure that whatever you're doing, whether it's large or small, is done with an eye towards who it's for. Because everyone, this was like a specific piece of conversation when we were having the thoughtful critiques session, everyone who makes a thing wants their thing to be used and appreciated by the people who they make it for. I guess maybe some artists are like purely self-driven, but most of us, we've got to do a thing, we want it to be used and to be useful, be effective. And so we've got three great perspectives on ways to get into that. And so with no further ado, I'd like to start with George A. from Greater Good Studio. He's going to talk about his perspective on the topic. Thank you, George.
Good? Yep. Hello, my name is George A. I'm going to be geeking out for about 15 minutes on public transit, if that's okay. Can I have a show of hands to see who came here on public transit today? Wow, a bunch. Very good. Did anyone drive or take a cab or car service? Couple. Anyone bike? Steve? Anyone take the water taxi? Okay, fair enough.
What about walkers?
Walking, biking, I actually bundled those together, so thank you for the walking. I took public transit here myself. Are we good? So the show of hands actually reflect a lot of the data that we have around public transit and transportation and sort of movement in the city of Chicago. The reason I bring it up is that the little decisions we all make every day, these little tiny decisions actually have fairly large impact around how all of us get around the city and some of the decisions we make as a city as a whole. Collectively, several million of you make these decisions, and they start to impact what the city projects as their predictions for economic growth, as well as where all of us might decide to live one day. So I live in Logan Square. I'm very lucky to have a local Blue Line station, and then I was able to walk here from Clark and Lake. So that's my story. So, like I said, the reason why I bring it up is because these decisions have really huge impact throughout all of us in Chicago. I'm safely assuming that all of us live here in Chicago. Is that correct? Anybody in from out of town? Okay. So going back a few years, back in 2008, I was actually the lead designer at the CTA, at the Chicago Transit Authority. I was brought in for, with a recent leadership change at the time, to think about user-centeredness and see if maybe the design of things and the design of the services that we provide as a public transit agency actually might need to be thought about a little more than just the way that they are currently designed now. You would think that was actually fairly obvious, but this role had never been created before. and after I left, it doesn't exist again. So the idea of a lead designer that thinks about how users interact with the city, and particularly public transit, seems to be like a fairly necessary part of the makeup of the city. When I was there, I got a really strong sense that the interesting tension that starts to exist between public services and the public that we serve was ironically kind of brought together in this quote from a colleague of mine, who I believe at the time was joking. He says, we'd have a great service if it wasn't for all the people. He was kind of joking to say how buses would run on time, people wouldn't be complaining, everything would work just tickety-boo if it wasn't for all of us lot. And I thought, wait, you're not really serious about that. And he goes, yeah, kind of. And what it sort of speaks to is the fact that whenever public agencies and large public services interact with the public, there are ways in which you can go about doing it where you maybe improve the service of the people that you're trying to serve, or do it begrudgingly. And I kind of got a sense that it was more on the begrudging end than necessarily the end where it was serving in a truly user-centered fashion. Some of the ways in which the public transit agencies would interact with the public was around things like surveys, or they would take town hall meetings, or any other sort of, I think, somewhat clumsy manners in which public services would interact and gauge their performance with the public. So in many ways, the CTA was really, really good at making sure that things move, these large boxes. And you would say that arguably is actually what their number one job should be, is to move large boxes of things, which in this case buses and trains, and they do that very well. That is their number one focus. But it seemed like my job was to sort of try and work out, well, what does it actually feel like to be inside one of those boxes? So this logistics kind of angle that the CTA takes is actually very, very relevant. I used to make the analogy that CTA is a little bit like FedEx. They're really good at making these boxes move, but the issue is that the boxes are full of people. So my job was like, well, what does it really feel like to be in them? And could the experience of being in these boxes actually be quite positive, possibly to the point where you want to decide to take it as opposed to take it out of necessity. So with all of that, at the time, one of the issues that I faced was, how does one design those experiences so that it becomes meaningful? And unfortunately, around the same, after about 11 months of being at the CTA, I was given the boot. There was a change in leadership, the same one that had sort of gracefully brought me in, at the same time, almost 11 months after, rather ungracefully booted me out. The change happened whereby, because the role had never existed before, when the leadership changed, people stopped answering my phone calls, and the question of, well, why do we need this person in the first place came up. So, poof, I was disappeared. It was a little bit like organ rejection, if you think about it, where this transplant had been brought in, and everybody thought at the time was very interesting. As soon as the antibodies disappeared, politically speaking, I was given an exit. So that being said, I kind of found my way back to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, so I now teach full-time as a professor, and I have an agenda around sort of design on a large public city scale. And there, I've had a great time thinking about how these issues, these large citywide issues, still affect us all. So for me, as a designer, I still have this itch that I really want to scratch when it comes to public transit and around city design, because as a designer, I think that that's one of the few ways you can really affect a lot of people at once. So when I had this opportunity to go to the CTA, and I thought that as a designer, I thought, well, if I can actually help and I don't take this chance, I kind of forfeit my right to whine about it. I kind of forfeit my opportunity to complain about what it's like to be at the CTA and write it and complain like most people do if I don't actually try to affect something. And that still exists now. So even though I was sort of asked to leave, it still bothers me that I didn't have enough impact. It still bothers me that as a designer, I can't make more change, more affect more, or have more of an impact at CTA. So in this non-whining aspect, I'm still trying to see if there's a way I can help. So just about 2 years ago, my wife and I co-founded a company called Greater Good Studio. We created this company to use a large general couple of terms. The one main thrust was to use design methods to solve for social problems, as opposed to the ones that we used to previously use when we were working for our corporate clients. What we used to do was use design to solve for business problems, and now we feel like there's a really interesting shift in using those same methods, but for a completely different type of user set. So when we were thinking about how can we help, how can maybe we can still scratch this itch, we realized, well, we don't have several $100 million that laying around. If we did, we could possibly go ahead and start buying buses. They cost about $1 million a piece, so they add up after a while. So since we don't have that, and we don't have like a direct line to the CTA anymore, how can we affect change from the outside? Can we possibly even make more change from out here than we did from when I was inside directly? So we started asking ourselves, what assets do we have at our disposal? And it turns out that we actually have a fair number of assets, which all of you probably do as well, more than you think they do. One of them in our network, sorry, in our assets range, was having a large network of people that we knew about. Secondly, was the ability to maybe rally those folks and also ask potentially some more interesting questions than the one that have been asked. So we thought, how can we help? Now, in thinking about that, this question, rather than diving in and starting to maybe design something new, something that hadn't been created before, we realized, and certainly my experience at CTX rallied this, the idea of actually asking the questions to the public around engagement needed to be fixed almost more than the creation of a new tool in the first place. So rather than going ahead and start designing this new thing, which will ultimately become a transit app, we realized that what we really needed was a new model for public engagement. The current model that exists right now, like I said, is sort of through these very hands-off, roundabout ways that feel very clumsy to me. So we created a project called Designing Chicago with the emphasis specifically on creating a new process to allow for public engagement. And the way we're going to demonstrate that is through a transit app that we're designing right now. There's a term up here that says crowdsource design. Can I ask you if anyone here has actually heard of that term before? Can you raise your hand? Actually, a few. Good. Can I ask, Joe? You raise your hand, right? Can I ask what you've heard of it before?
From you.
Okay, not a good example. Is anyone else? Has anyone generally heard it before maybe now?
I mean, I didn't just now.
Okay, good.
I know you.
Okay, well, okay, fair enough. So what I heard was this. I'd always imagined that there was this sort of idea. When I'd heard about crowdsource design, I kept thinking there was an angry mob of people with Sharpies and Post-it notes, and they were just like, "Wah!" just screaming at the top of their lungs and just doing it as a mob would do. And I actually was very fortunate to see a project kind of in front of my eyes actually spawn a crowdsourced approach that actually produced some incredible results. We were designing a public school cafeteria with parents and with 5-year-olds and with the staff members at this amazing school called the Academy for Global Citizenship. That's a project we've done at Greater Good. And in that process, we realized, wow, actually, these people who are non-designers actually are pretty good at this if we ask them the right questions. And now, as a designer, I hope you understand, like it can come across as a bit of a threat to me to think that the crowd, as it were, this angry mob, can design things just as well as a trained designer can. Like it started to make me wonder, what am I actually doing? If that's the case, if the bar is so low and anybody can do it, then what is the point of me? And I realized, oh, you actually have to ask and frame the opportunities for these designers, these nascent designers. And then I still have a job, which made me feel very good again. But I realized that in that one particular instance, if you ask the right questions, you actually might get some really interesting results that can be augmented by the ones that you do as a professional. So we thought, rather than just trying for this angry mob approach, we might need to try and see if we can actually craft this, grab a hold of this very amorphous group of people. So this is a handy 2x2 that I have up here, but it has two different axes. The horizontal axis is called the quantity of people. The vertical axis is quality of understanding. So this graph outlines a number of different approaches one can take to understand people, or research in many ways. So in the bottom right-hand corner, this is sort of the approach that I've seen the CTA and other public transit agencies take. Lots and lots of people, but I would argue for fairly shallow understanding. Surveys, town hall meetings, and focus groups. That is fairly typical, and you end up with large sample sizes and some sort of rough idea of where things are going, or at least where the biggest source spots might be. On the far left here, which is a quantity of very few, and a quality of understanding not being all that high, that's what I would argue is my gut intuition. I can do this on my own, and I'm going to just go ahead with my research and say this is what I think needs to happen. Now, on the top left-hand corner, this ethnographic research. As a designer, this is sort of like the gold standard that we held by typically. It's not particularly high number of people. We might say about 6 to maybe 20 folks at most, but incredibly high levels of understanding, where we literally hang out with people all day and night if necessary to get a really strong understanding of what they're doing and why they're doing it. In the particular case of the cafeteria, we became lunch ladies. We monitored them from day and night. We put head cams on like little GoPros on 4-year-olds. We put time lapses on the ceiling. Like we get a really strong understanding of what is happening but with a limited set of folks. It's not like a million children, let's say. But in this top right corner, there's still a bit of a gap, we realized. How do you get lots and lots of people and lots and lots of understanding? No, I'm asking. Is anybody? Fine. Okay, so we weren't sure either. We were like, oh, I don't know. I really hope we can work out this unicorn type of approach to research, whereby we get lots of both. And we think maybe we might have had a shot at this. So the secret weapon that we have, we realized, is teaching. When we looked at all the assets that we've been looking at, a network of people, a smattering of design experience, we realized that teaching is one of our assets we have. I'm a teacher as a full-time professor at the School of the Art in Chicago. My wife and I also teach at Kellogg and are constantly in some sort of workshop in mode, it seems. And in that teaching model, you start to realize a couple of things about how teaching works. Has anyone actually been a teacher or is a teacher in the classroom? Oh, good. Okay, hi. So as a teacher, I think you may recognize that this phenomenon exists, which is fascinating. If you have enough faith in your students and give enough structure to your classes and then have the patience to let each of you grow, there is a really, truly transformative experience that happens on both sides. And we think that if we started thinking rather than a logistics or like a design talent issue or we don't have enough coders in the city, if that's not the issue, and we reframe it as teaching, to say the city is a classroom, we realize there's a completely different way of approaching this problem about how do you get a lot of people to become part of your team. Teaching actually, we think, could unlock all of this. So what we decided to do was, rather than call it Crowdsource Design, we've renamed it to name a public design team. We think that there may be a way whereby, through teaching, you can create a team of members who have never met each other before, who are all drawn to a common cause, who are, in a sense, untrained, but can be very, very powerful if you can nudge it. So this public design team is what we've created. And we're directing that effort towards a public transit app, as yet unnamed, which will happen very soon, hopefully either on iOS first, but most likely might even become a web app. There's a number of technical issues as to how that might end up having to be resolved. But the public transit app itself is going to be something that we're actually directing all this effort towards. It will be a mobile app for transit riders. So we're going to be asking these questions of, rather than, let's say, technological questions of what can we do, we're going to be asking questions around need. Rather than asking ourselves what can we do, we want to ask ourselves what should we do. Again, because it's based on riders, and the riders being this public transit team, public design team, we can ask these types of questions before we start going ahead and start coding a single line of any technology. So we said, okay, let's do this. Let's do this thing. Let's do this crazy public design team. We're going to launch it as a Kickstarter in the most public way possible. We invited everybody we knew. We had probably 300 people in our studio. We launched this as a Kickstarter, and everybody said, "You guys are crazy. It was never going to work. You're going to have terrible results. You're never going to raise the money. You're out of your minds." It was really, really put ourselves out there, and we launched it to great fanfare. We got tons of press as soon as we started launching it, and everyone was right. Oh, I'm sorry. Unfortunately, the slides won't progress because it's a PDF now, but our Kickstarter didn't make the goal. After 30 days, we excruciatingly had to watch this. It was enormous fanfare. This money that was supposedly out there never quite reached its goal, and it was probably the most embarrassing, gut-wrenching, professionally humbling experience I've ever had to go through. And after 30 days of watching that happen, we had to kind of pick ourselves up. And after several days of crying myself to sleep, we had to ask ourselves, well, what are we going to do next? And what we realized is that once we'd failed so epically in this way in front of everyone, all the pressure was off us. We were off the hook. You can't screw it up after you screwed it up so badly. So we were completely allowed to screw it up some more, supposedly. So we realized that, oh, let's still do this thing. Let's just do this thing anyway, because who cares? No one's even watching us anymore. So there's a phrase that I often say to my students, which is that success hides learning. When you're doing well and you successfully sort of get through your task, lessons that could have been learned are still there, but you're too busy patting yourself on the back, and so is everyone else. So in this case, because we had failed, the lesson was very, very much in my face, and I couldn't ignore it. The simple lesson here being that we need to simplify the story. We need to simplify how we were asking these untrained, sort of unwashed masses, as it were, to help us with this project. So there are three principles that I wanted to take away from our project that I wanted to share with you guys. And they've now led us towards actually getting a lot of momentum in this project, despite that pause during the Kickstarter. The first one is the first principle is give your team a name. Seems rather simple. We asked everyone to participate to take on the persona, this moniker of an urban agent. It sounds kind of sexy. It sounds like this sort of secret, mysterious role, when actually it's really nerdy kind of experience of just becoming a researcher. We asked everyone to take on this persona of an urban agent and help us with research, and then ultimately help us with design. And everyone took it really seriously. They were actually starting to sign off their emails with Agent 44 or what's up, Agent 77, and actually responding to each other in email through these terms. And half the people, probably 90% of the people, I still don't know their real names. But they once we made the offer to become part of the team, they actually started to take their responsibilities a lot more seriously than I might have expected. The second principle, respect your team's intelligence. This one seems really obvious, but again, back to that notion of surveys and such, I've often found that the questions themselves and the team's assets themselves don't really get used to the greatest degree. We know that the members of our team are incredibly smart. It's basically you guys and more. And the types of assets that they have in their disposal includes their ability to navigate the CTA, which is not an easy feat, to be honest, and the ability to take intelligent answers to these questions. So this kind of thing here, this is typical of the kind of thing that the CTA might put out there. Now I would never argue that there's a stupid question. I would argue that there are sometimes questions that are deeply flawed. So the idea of being able to rate your service from 1 to 10 and the CTA being able to somehow do something with that, I think is kind of troubling. What exactly are they meant to do when you answer with a 7 or 5, let's say, or a 3? Do I just improve my service now? So what I'm trying to get to is how do I actually make actual tangible results out of the feedback that we get from our people? And if we want to do that, we actually have to change the way we ask these questions.
Was that your survey?
No, I just found it on Flickr. So we don't use surveys, typically. I mean, there may be if we absolutely had to, but that would be in a very specific case around needing large quantities for something very crude. The kinds of research that we were trying to do involved actually shooting video. So again, because it doesn't play, it's a PDF, we actually had to start creating training materials that allow for people who are not designers and researchers to become part of our team. So we shot many hours with it, then edited down to very short videos, a series of training videos on how to become a researcher that allowed a completely untrained sort of participant to become part of our team. So one of the questions we asked was to observe your commute and look out for transit tools. So by asking these types of questions, rather than rating our service, we're trying to eliminate the ability for our participants to whine about the service. Our natural tendency, I think, for a lot of us is to complain about it. So if you don't ask questions that allow for people to complain, you won't hear them. So we think that that's a shift. One of the amazing things that we found from our research is that in 2 different instances, one agent wrote back to say they took a photo of the Cubs stadium to say when they are traveling through the city, they actually look up the Cubs schedule to work out whether or not to take the train that day. Has anyone used that approach? Has anyone been on a train with a bunch of drunks? So for those folks who had already worked it out, I'm so glad there's a couple in the room. How did you work that out?
I had an app or just telling me when Cubs games were.
And it wasn't connected to transit?
No, it wasn't. So I would cross-reference that with the very hard-to-use app that they have.
Yeah.
I would just try to plan my whole day around not taking the train during those times.
That is fascinating. And what we found was that there are hundreds of you like that who all have these little tiny nuggets around how to navigate the city because you've made it work. What we'd like to do is try to see if we can capture those insights around how to make a random nugget of information pivotal to your decision that day around how to get around the city. To me, that's fascinating. This other example here is one urban agent that used to use the skyline as their way to know whether or not they're on the right side of the tracks at the metro. Is anyone taking the metro? I can never tell which side I'm supposed to be on. So this is their clue as to how to navigate it. Like these are little tiny insights that if we weren't asking, we might never know. And maybe perhaps you've told a friend of ours, you might want to check the schedule through this app.
Oh yeah.
Those little tiny nuggets, those interactions, we want to get them on a big citywide scale. So rather than just looking for functional needs, we started trying to see if we can find these emotional needs. Can we put our app on that right-hand side, we think? So these are some of the insights we found from our research. The ability for our app to be able to constantly be able to reroute to plan B. What we kept finding was that plan A If it works, awesome, good for you. You don't need their app. It's plan B through Z that you need the app for. And even today, when I was wondering if I'm actually going to make it out in time, I did, just about. I'm thinking already in my head, what is plan C and D going to be? Is plan C calling Dan saying, shit, I'm really late? Or is plan B getting on a bus and switching gears altogether? Our app needs to be able to function that way. Understanding the true cost of options. So when you go downtown, often for those who are driving, there can be calculators that just assume that because of the price of gas right now, you can get downtown for less than the price of a bus, which actually isn't true when you consider how much time it takes to park as well. So the calculations that sometimes people use in apps give a false sense of priority. And lastly, accelerate my learning, which is a notion around how can I become a better Chicagoan altogether. So last principle, and I'll wrap up very soon. Give the team tools to respond with solutions. What that simply means is we have to create not only the questions, but also the ability for people to respond. So we were amazed, simply amazed, that over about 3 months, we got over 900 submissions of research and ideas from all around the world, from people who volunteered their time to help us out in a project. Some of them are expert writers like Steve, let's say, and then some of them have never really been in public transit much at all. So that blew us away. This is some of the ideas that came in. We even had people actually texting in their ideas. We were sending out texts 2 times in a day, one in the morning, one in the evening, to catch people while they were getting pissed off. Which we thought was, there's a pretty good chance that someone's going to be upset somewhere in Chicago. So we would send out a bunch of texts and get responses with, God damn it, I wish this thing was here. And then we would find a nugget of information there. So we built an amazing website through, we hosted the website, but also a gentleman called Scott Robin helped us with the back end. And Scott, some of you know, he's a fascinating, brilliant designer, and he's a great database developer for us. He helped us build the ability to capture all of these feedback through email. Now, because of the way that we've done it, everything had been very, very internet-based. We realized that there are actually opportunities to actually host things in person, more like a teaching classroom model. So we started hosting workshops in our class, in our studio, and running it just like a class, and it was really fascinating for us. Now, for many of you, or many of our critics who had talked to us beforehand, they kept saying, "Isn't it going to be a problem that these people can't draw?" Or, "Wait, they've never designed an app before. How can they actually help?" And what I often said is that really talent is simply ability to do without training. It's really just the ability. The fact that you haven't done it before is a knowledge or training gap. The fact that you may or may not actually have any supposed talent is completely not. It's nonsense, but also irrelevant when we're trying to just draw early wireframes towards an app. Whether you need to actually be a talented coder is just a moot point. It's so early in the process that we don't need that. So what we realize is that if that becomes a barrier, if there's a perceived barrier for participation, we need to eliminate that early on. So we had amazing workshops. We had people participate in our work, and we got some really fascinating feedback around how the app should work. We even had a session where we actually got people to design their own apps using just paper templates, drawing out wireframes, and every one of them then pitched the idea to us in little 2-minute videos. And we found that with every single person's version of their app, using the same toolset, absolutely every app was very different than each other. So what we learned is that our app has to be very flexible in how it's going to respond to each of these people's needs. We were very fortunate also in the middle of last year to get some recognition from the TED community. So we were awarded the TED Prize at the end of, towards the end of last year for this very highly participatory process that we've been taking. The TED Prize in the past has been given to one individual. This year was very unusual. They gave it to 10 different individuals all around the world working on projects around city and the way that cities can respond to participation. So we were one of the 10 recipients from last year. We also got sort of a good number of press. Now the biggest issue for us, and it all sounds really fascinating and like good for us, but our biggest issue is the fact that right now we still have a very limited number of people that we've talked to. We've met a lot of folks akin to you, and you guys are not that typical. To be honest, like you're not that normal, okay? You guys are in a quite an upper sort of right-hand quadrant. If we were to make a cross-section of the entire city of Chicago, we met certainly a lot of folks who were very internet savvy. We met a lot of folks who were technologically capable. But there are tons and tons of people that we never met. Tons of people that are in schools, in churches, in community groups, simply completely oblivious to right now. So our commitment is to now take the wireframes that we've drawn from all of the research we've done, and now take those out into the field to test with users. There are lots and lots of people who just simply didn't hear about our Kickstarter project as much as I might think that got everywhere, and they will never hear about it. Good, I'm glad. But we need to make an effort to actually reach out to people who are not like us. Non-savvy, non-sort of educated. And those folks are our big sort of push right now. So in wrap up, these are the 3 principles I want to leave you with. Give your team a name, respect your team's intelligence, and lastly, give the team tools to respond with solutions. Thanks very much. Questions, or we?
Yeah, I think if anyone has questions, I mean, obviously there might be stuff that comes together after we have all 3 of the talks. Does anyone?
So what's happening with your app?
So our biggest challenge. Tell me about it. The biggest challenge right now is that we have no funding. The 4 of us in the team is designers, researchers, but no coders. We've never had a technical member of the team. So the Kickstarter, in many ways, had originally been to raise the money to hire the developers. And originally had pegged it at $125,000, which is problematic, actually, for everyone who isn't an app developer. They said, that's crazy, that's too much money. I don't understand why you need $125K when my app is free. Or the app developer said, that's crazy, that's way too low. You need 3 times that much. So we were kind of a little bit screwed in both directions. And one of my friends actually actively said, I'm really glad you didn't get the money because you really dodged a bullet. You would have made a crap app at $125,000. So our struggle right now is that we don't have funding. But our momentum is building towards developing a grant to get the funding so that we can build a team. That's where we are, unfortunately.
So this sort of touches on an issue that comes up a lot at work, because we always have designers or architects who create paper prototypes and the code. This is more, have you thought about maybe trying to engage the designer or the developer as part of the design team rather than the worker bee who has to come in and build what you've designed afterwards? Because then they'll probably charge you less if they feel like they have a piece of the design or like they've contributed to it.
Sure.
This happens a lot when one of the reasons there's just a shortage of people with the skills to build things and lots of people with ideas. And one of the ways to get people to, like the OpenGov illustration of that, where you get them, you almost treat them like a customer or a user that, as a user whose needs you need to, one of their needs is to feel like they're participating in the design process.
Sure, I don't think it was ever our intent to sort of throw something over the fence and kind of wish best of luck to the developer. The phase that we're in right now, actually, to your question earlier, we're going to be taking the wireframes that we had, this very early set of features, and we are going to be shopping it to a number of different developers in the city as well as abroad, like in San Francisco, to get their opinion on what they believe is the right approach, and also to help us build a quote. Those quotes and their perspectives will help us build the grant that we need, or at least the application, to go to a funding body to say, this is what we believe it's going to cost us, and here's the developer that we think we're going to be working with. They have put some commitment into it, and they believe that these are the right features to work on.
I don't need to be critical. It's a problem for everyone.
It's super challenging.
Always comes up how to get
the reason why we've delayed conversation with the developer is primarily why we've taken this approach in the first place, is that we want to have these perspectives that are non-technological to be put in a certain moment in the process as opposed to be the first thing you do. I think there's a really strong emphasis on the lean process, which allows for people to sort of make sure things are getting resolved and iterated on in a very rapid manner, which I think is perfectly fine. It's very akin to design, but I think that there may be a phase even before the lean process starts to ask sort of what should we be doing with our users before even that process kicks in, which is why we've sort of delayed their interaction. But we fully intend to get their involvement, and ideally we would just have them as part of our team. Yeah.
Give me a short statement on what problem it is that your app will address.
So there are a couple of things. So the apps that are out there in the transit world are either typically real-time, and they provide you with a little sliver that says, my next bus is coming in 5 minutes. Or there are apps that tell you the entire journey for places you've never been to before, like Google Maps. Google Maps right now doesn't provide you with real-time information. They tell you typically scheduled information about what's going to be happening, and they're predictive sort of, we assume things are happening, so as long as there's no actual delays, we'll assume that you will get here within 35 minutes. What we're trying to do is try and see if we can blend those two together in order to have real-time information available for complete route planning. Now, what's challenging is that for those who are commuters, there often isn't a need because you already know exactly most of what you need to know. You just need to typically know how late am I going to be. Now, for those who have never gone that trip before, they need complete hand-holding. So our app is going to try and see if we can bridge both of those worlds for those who are new as well as those who are experienced. And the irony is that even though you may have moved to the city here, you're almost, so even if you've been in the city for many, many years and you know you commute very well, going to a new part of the town actually kind of puts you back in that newbie mode again. So our app is really meant to be this personal concierge of sorts around transit, so that you don't have to be juggling 15 different apps, a little bit like our friend here. Yeah.
Mark, I have a really quick and short question.
Okay.
Is there a reason why you selected the iOS over Android?
This is a really good question.
Typically,
we still actually haven't picked it. It's a very challenging question. It's short, but the answer, unfortunately, won't be as short. It goes back and forth, and I think depending on which data set you choose and also which week you choose it from, there's a lot of competing information around whether apps are being used and on which platforms. The best that I've heard so far is that iOS is about 50%-ish of the market share, Android's being the other half. And unfortunately, the other half, those Android users typically don't use apps. So even though there may be massive amounts of market penetration, the apps themselves are not particularly being used by that demographic, which is curious. So we could argue that perhaps going with iOS first would allow us to have a really robust app that you could argue perhaps not everyone is using. Then you could say, what if we did Android only, and then run the risk that no one will actually use it? The only other approach that we've heard of that's a middle ground is to develop a web app. It's something that can be accessed through a browser. The biggest challenge with web browser, sort of web app technology right now, is that there are certain bits of hardware that you want to have access to from the device, like your GPS, that makes it very accurate, as well as photos. That would be helpful to have access to, which makes it go down a native, they call it a native app route. So the answer, unfortunately, still hasn't been decided upon, but once I do make it, or once we decide what it is, I think we have to build a very strong argument why. It's super challenging right now in terms of making that decision and being able to argue for it. Do you have any thoughts?
well, just looking at, because I've played with Coco and Eclipse, and they're both your head developing programs for apps and things of that nature.
For iOS or for Android?
For iOS 5, you have Coco. SDK, that's what people generally interface with to create what you're looking at on the
Is it called Xcode?
Say again?
Is it called Xcode?
Coco is part of what
Coco.
you manage with Xcode.
Yeah,
Okay.
UI process.
exactly. Then you have Eclipse, which for the Android developer, they rely heavily on to pull up your different libraries in order to put things together. And I talk to people who deal with apps, and a lot of the time they say that though it's not as pretty as an app with Apple, it is more cost effective, and you don't bump into the legalities of, oh no, it has to have this, and this for them to approve it to be in the App Store.
Okay.
I think we're starting down a religious turn here.
I think everything you said is completely true. It's very complicated, unfortunately, because with every decision one makes, we have a cascading series of responses that have to be credible. One potential fly in the ointment around Android development is that the fragmentation around the iOS and the number of handsets that are out there makes it incredibly challenging to work out if the thing we release is compatible with even half of the Android handsets even in this room. There are just so many of them by different manufacturers who could take, they call it forks or different versions of that same OS. It becomes very, very challenging to work out what is the truest version of this app and will it be any good. So part of me wants to argue for making a really great app first and then proving that it works and then going back for Android. But I would worry that I will piss everybody off in that journey back. Because you could argue that not everybody has an iPhone. And if we want to make sure we get as much of the city of Chicago, maybe we shouldn't do it. But that conversation is yet to come. Thank you.
One last question?
Yeah, hi.
Hi. So I think you've done a really interesting process of getting all the different ideas and people to lay out the frames. What is your thinking around how to take all of that information and whittle it down and decide what direction you're going to go? You've created this sort of little democracy, but at the end of the day, there's a team that's making a decision about what this app will look like. So can you comment on that, on how you're thinking of?
So if we continued and just kept leaving the door open for everyone to have input, I think that will become more back on the angry mob end, as opposed to a curated, edited team. So I think that our role as project creators and as designers, frankly now, is for me to edit. I think that's the largest responsibility I have. So when asking for participation, I think we made it pretty clear that we ultimately will get to say what happens. The challenge is how do we make that editing happen where we don't alienate everyone that participated. I think that by carefully telling everyone what the process steps that we've been going on and where we project to be, that's one clue. Secondly, every time we do make a decision, I think we have to have a very strong set of arguments as to why. So if we do say, ultimately, we're going to go with Android, we have to tell everyone on the team who has an iPhone, sorry, but you're going to have to wait. And if you have to wait, please wait maybe this many months until we get around to it, because we think there may be that many more people who can
And by
enjoy this.
team, you mean the 300 some people that
On the team, exactly.
Okay.
So as long as we have a strong communication angle with them, open channel with them, I think it's okay. But I think our job is to actually work out what decisions to make as opposed to let it up for vote every time.
Mm-hmm.
We really are just trying to see if we can get a greater sense for what should happen. And the best way to sort of visualize this team is to think of it as just being an extra team member on your staff that's just made up of 100 people. So it's still one body, but they just happen to have a lot of eyeballs. So, if you know what I mean. So you get to say whether or not you should take that opinion, but you have to be prepared. If you asked it, you have to be ready to receive the feedback from it. So that's sort of how we've been handling it.
All right, great. Let's
Thank you so much.
Sharon, there'll be more time for questions.